Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this really rainy day in May in New York. I apologize for the weather. Welcome to the Institute of Public Knowledge. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist. I'm based here. I am the convener and founder of the Co-opting AI series. I work on developing a sociology of design and inequality, particularly in the context of artificial intelligence and policy. Now, before we begin and I introduce the absolutely stellar panel that we have tonight, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. IPK also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusion and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. To open this event, I also want to say a few words about why we need to co-opt AI and why it is important to do this in terms of justice. The thing that we call AI, and it is really quite unclear what that is at this moment in time, plays an increasingly important role in all kinds of ways in which we organize social life. It sort of determines what kinds of ads are displayed to us on social media platforms, whether we receive a loan or not, if we get that job interview, how we navigate the city, and so on. AI is also a fully fledged hype that is captivating the imagination of governments, corporations, and individuals alike. There's a lot of talk about the global AI race, with nations rushing to position themselves in what is perceived as a new arena of competition largely dictated by China, and not fall behind in the fourth industrial revolution. We must all fear the arrival of the robots. They will take our jobs before they take over entirely as our new artificial overlords. That's the biggest threat to society, we hear. So we are engulfed in a totalizing narrative that positions AI as inevitably determining our collective future, for better or for worse. The political problem, and by that I mean a problem that has everything to do with power, is that the people who tell the totalizing AI story deliberately blur our view for the limits of this technology, and therefore make it difficult for us to ask difficult questions around how they work or not, and into which contexts they should be integrated, and into which ones they shouldn't. They systematically exclude those who will be affected by AI. The other political problem with the totalizing narrative of AI is what is often described as the so-called black box problem. The notion that the algorithm's reasoning cannot be understood by a human because it is too complex. This is how we, on the one hand, end up with a growing mountain of AI technologies that inflict harm based on race, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, age, and so on. And on the other hand, have a bunch of tech firms and their clients claiming that they didn't know the algorithm would discriminate because they cannot see inside AI's black box. Like AI invented sexism and racism and discrimination and inequality. This is where justice, or rather injustice, really comes into full sight. Those who are affected by it, who do not get the job, the loan, the rental, or who lose their insurance, are burdened with correcting that narrative, if they even can. So ultimately, I think the real AI threat is already here. The real threat is that with all the noise around AI, you really miss what is at stake. AI prompts us to reevaluate the big questions relating to power, democracy, and inequality, and what it means to be human. I think that we must co-opt the AI discourse to keep asking these questions, and to ask the questions from a social and political point of view, not just from an economical or technological one. Failing to do so, that is the real threat to society, not the robots. And this is really what the Co-opting AI series are all about, sort of flipping the AI script, taking the AI hype as a cue to have broader conversations about society, design, technology, inequality, and democracy. And what better way to do this against the backdrop of justice. So without further ado, please let me introduce our absolutely stellar panel tonight. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to come up individually, and then we're going to take a seat and have the panel discussion. First up is going to be Virginia Eubanks, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany, SUNY. She's the author of Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile Police, and Punish the Poor. Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age, and co-editor with Alethia Jones of Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. Her writing about technology and social justice has appeared in Scientific American, The Nation, Harper's, and Wired. For 2 decades, Virginia has worked in community technology and economic justice movements. She was a founding member of the Our Data Bodies Project and a 2016-2017 fellow at New America. For Automating Inequality, last week, Virginia received the McGannon Center Book Prize 2019. Alondra Nelson is president of the Social Science Research Council and professor of sociology at Columbia University. She will soon take up her new appointment as professor and Harold F. Lindner Chair in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study. An award-winning scholar of science, medicine, and social inequality, Alondra's recent books include The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, Genetics and the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History, and Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party, and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. Alondra has contributed to national policy discussions on inequality and about the social implication of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, big data, direct-to-consumer genetics, and human gene editing. She serves on the board of directors of the Data and Society Research Institute. Alondra is also chair of the American Sociological Association on Science, Knowledge, and Technology, and is an elected member of the Sociological Research Association. Sorry. Sasha Costanza-Chock, our scholar, activist, and media maker, and currently associate professor of civic media at MIT. They are a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, faculty affiliate with the MIT Open Documentary Lab and the MIT Center for Civic Media, and creator of the MIT Co-Design Studio. Their work focuses on social movements, transformative media organizing, and design justice. Sasha's first book, Out of the Shadows, Into the Streets, Transmedia Organizing and the Immigrant Rights Movement, was published by the MIT Press in 2014. They are a board member of the Allied Media Project, AMP. AMP convenes the annual Allied Media Conference and cultivates media strategies for more just, creative, and collaborative worlds. Sasha's new book, called Design Justice, will be out in the fall, or early 2020, with MIT Press. And our last speaker is Amanda Lewandowski, who is currently a clinical teaching fellow with the NYU Technology Law and Policy Clinic, where she's also an Engelbert Center Fellow and affiliate researcher with the Information Law Institute. Her clinical projects and scholarship focus on developing practical approaches to cutting-edge problems at the intersection of intellectual property, information policy, and the public interest. Previously, she has worked as an associate at Cooley and Kirkland at Ellis in New York. Amanda will soon be based at Georgetown's Law School. Welcome. Wonderful. We're going to start with Virginia.
Now we're going to see if I can flip pages and hold mics at the same time. It's a question mark, but we're going to work it out together. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be here. It's cold, it's damp, it's rainy. You came out. Thank you so much. Thank you, internet people who didn't come out. Stay home and drink tea. That's fine. We're glad to have you. Thanks so much to Mona for bringing this incredible group of people together. I'm going to try to stay short because I'm actually really interested in this this conversation more than I'm interested in what I have to say. I will say that, I'm Virginia Eubanks. Hi. I wrote a book called Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. It basically tells 3 stories from the point of view of people who see themselves as targets of the sort of newest sort of high-tech automated decision-making tools in public services around the United States. So I tell a story about an attempt to automate and privatize all of the eligibility programs for welfare services in the state of Indiana. I tell a story about a tool called the Coordinated Entry System, which is actually widespread around the country and increasingly around the world, is intended to match the most vulnerable unhoused people with the most appropriate available resource for them. Proponents call it the Match.com of homeless services. I reported on that story in Los Angeles County, not because that's the only place that coordinated entry is happening, but because the scale of the human crisis, that is the housing crisis in Los Angeles, is so really astronomical, so off the charts. And the third story I tell in the book is about a predictive model that's supposed to be able to guess which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county where Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania. And normally when I do talks like this, it's really important to me, though I did 105 interviews over the course of the research for the book. I started each story from the point of view and sort of embedded in the story of folks who are most impacted by these systems. So in Indiana, I talked to folks who lost access to their public benefits when this tool rolled out. In Los Angeles, I spoke to folks in the unhoused community, both those who had been housed through coordinated entry and those who were still living in encampments. And in Allegheny County, I started all the stories from the point of view of families who were being risk rated by this tool. It's really, really important for me to always say when I talk about the book that the book would not exist without the extraordinary courage of the people who shared their stories with me. They did so on the record, using their real names and the real story and the real place. They're identifiable in the book, and they're folks who are overall very, very vulnerable in their day-to-day lives. So they're counting on the state for the basic things they need to stay alive and stay healthy. So food, housing, access to their children, and family integrity. So I want to sort of honor the contribution that they made to the book and also their courage in sharing their stories with us so that we can have these kinds of conversations. Normally, when I talk about the book, I then launch into telling you stories about the people I talk to because it is really important for me to get their voices in the room. I'm actually not going to do that today, sorry, because I've got limited time, 1, and because 2, I have been sort of on the road off and on for about 18 months behind this book now. And I'm getting towards the end of my walking and talking period of this book. And I actually sat down to think about this event and said, like, you know what? I actually think there are a couple of sort of reflections or insights I might be able to offer and like what I continue to learn out in public talking about this book. One thing I learned is that you should be forced to tour a book for a year before you publish it, but I don't know how that works administratively, so I haven't worked that out yet. My thinking is a lot clearer, actually, about the book than it was a year ago in a lot of ways. So I want to offer, depending on time, who's got the watch? You've got the watch? Okay. Don't let me go over 13 minutes, okay? Because I'm from the South. I can talk. I can spin a tale. So 4, maybe 5 short sort of reflections on what I've been thinking about since I've been talking about the book. And they all sort of fall under one framework of thinking about automated decision-making tools and risk models and the other kinds of technology tools we're talking about today. And that the big lesson, the umbrella lesson, is that numbers are actually stories. They're as shaped by human beings as narratives are. We really get into trouble with numbers when we use them to obscure the fact that we're actually telling stories, right? When we use them as a sort of promise that political decision-making can happen without politics. So that's the sort of frame that I want to open this series of reflections in, just thinking about numbers as stories, but stories that are weirdly make invisible their own making. And what kind of political problems that creates for us when we start talking about things like artificial intelligence and justice. Okay, so 4, maybe 5 lessons. First, beware the cult of accuracy. I cannot tell you how many times on this tour folks who build these tools have tried to pull me onto the ground of arguing only about accuracy and technical fairness. This is a trick if I'm being cynical about it, or a naivete if I'm being generous. So never mind that accuracy is actually remarkably hard to measure in human services, things like child welfare, which is one of the places I worked, because we're actually modeling systems that we're intervening in. So it's basically almost impossible to know whether predictions you make about the future in a system you're intervening in are correct, accurate, or not. So let's put that aside. Like what, again, because that's getting dragged onto the land of accuracy. And we're not going there. We're staying in the country of justice. We're not getting dragged onto the island of accuracy. Because I think more importantly than whether or not we can truly be accurate with these tools, staying on the island of accuracy boxes us in to sets of solutions that aren't really solutions in the way we mean, I hope, when we talk about justice. For example, you can reach increased technical fairness and accuracy in child welfare, which is a system that's beset by racial disproportionality, by putting more white kids in foster care. So that actually is a way to increase fairness in the system, is to just take more white kids out of their families. And so this sounds like a crazy thing to say. I was at an event organized by Joyce McMillan of the children, at the time of the Children's Welfare Organizing Project, with a staff member from ACS, which is the Administration for Child Services here in New York City. It was a room that had a lot of parents, a lot of parents who have been child welfare involved in the past. It was a tough room for this person from ACS. So bless them for their attempts to be accountable. But about 2/3 of the way through the conversation, this person got quite defensive because the room was pushing back on them about racial disproportionality. And sort of half under his breath, he said, well, y'all should be happy now. Because of the opioid epidemic, we're taking way more white kids. And the room just went ice silent. It was so clear that that was not the model of justice that anyone in the room was using, that wasn't something affected parents wanted, and that wasn't the model, right? But actually, if we allow ourselves to be dragged onto the island of accuracy, or even of the archipelago of technical fairness, those are the kinds of solutions that actually reach that. And we need to not let ourselves be pulled into that argument. It's the wrong argument to be having, and we're ceding way too much ground if we allow ourselves to be pulled into conversations that are falsely bounded by these values alone. Fairness and accuracy, even equity, are not justice. Jennifer Eaglin, by the way, has done great work around the cult of accuracy. 2, and I only have 5 minutes left, so we're not going to get to 5. But 2, discretion is never created or destroyed, it's only ever moved. It's like my very smart political scientist friend Joe Sauce says, it's like energy. Discretion is never created or destroyed, it's only ever moved. So in Indiana, former Governor Mitch Daniels seemed to believe that the relationship between caseworkers and clients was an invitation to collusion, that basically empathy and human relationship opened the door to fraud in public assistance in his state. So the Family and Social Service Administration there, the FSSA is what it's called, decided that the solution was to remove discretion from the front line by modernizing and privatizing welfare eligibility decisions in Indiana. But the question here isn't, should we allow, the question isn't discretion, yes or no. The question is who has discretion? Discretion who? So they actually, in Indiana, did take discretion away from frontline caseworkers, but they didn't take it out of the system. They just moved it. They took it from frontline caseworkers and they gave it to the people who wrote the vendor contracts, to the engineers at IBM who wrote the software, and to the labor process gurus at ACS who designed incentives at the call center that was replacing frontline call work. So I think it's really important to remember, I tell a historical story at the beginning of the book about the rise of what I call the digital poorhouse. I got involved in this work through activism and organizing, but one of the real light bulb moments about this book was when I went to the New York State Archives and I started looking for the design documents for one of the early information management systems in public assistance in New York State, which was called WMS, the Welfare Management System. And I thought maybe it had been designed in the 80s or the 90s. So I go to the archives, I'm looking for the design documents, and I'm like, 1996, welfare reform, that's probably when I have, oh, no, it was already there. Okay, so I went back to let's say mid-80s when the technology was sort of widely available. Nope, it was already there. Kept going back through the archives until I hit 1968. Which is when the first system in New York State started to be designed. It's called the National Demonstration Project, became WMS and the Medicaid Management Information System. And the thing that's so interesting about understanding those tools as being beginning to be implemented in the late 60s and early 70s, rather than in the 80s and 90s, is it gives you the context for what problems those tools were intended to solve. And one of the problems those tools were intended to solve was in 1968, 8,000 frontline caseworkers walked off the job here in New York City, in the boroughs of New York City, not to protect their own employment contract, but to lower the barriers to welfare receipt for their clients. And 6 months later is when we got the first one of these digital tools in welfare. I don't think that's accidental. And I don't think it's accidental that we see the widespread uptake of these tools at the same time as an all-out assault on public employment today. So I think there's a really good lesson there about how dangerous that relationship across the desk is, and how potentially productive of allyship it is. I'm going to give one more lesson. Three or four. Okay, three. Third lesson, big picture lesson, is these tools really only make sense in the context of political austerity. This idea that there's not enough for everyone, and we have to make really hard decisions between who deserves to access their basic human rights and who does not, or who has to wait. One of the things that I saw across the research for the book and talking about the book among designers was how many of them were extraordinarily bright, extraordinarily well-intentioned, really cared deeply about the people their agencies served. But they agreed kind of on one thing, which was that these tools are necessary, perhaps regrettable, but necessary tools for doing a kind of digital triage, for deciding who needs the emergency room of public benefits and who can wait. But it's really only appropriate to use the language of triage in the context that a crisis is temporary and more resources are coming. In Los Angeles, for example, there are 58,000 unhoused people, 75% of whom are entirely unsheltered, not in an emergency shelter at all, just living in encampments, in cars, and otherwise out. There's few available resources, though folks are working hard on that. And there's a widespread professional middle class resistance to building or repurposing more housing. So if more resources aren't coming to actually match the scale of the human rights crisis, it's actually not digital triage. What we're actually doing is automating rationing. And we should call it by its real name. And I think too often we don't do that. So we live in a world of abundance, not scarcity. What is it? Something like 8 individuals own half the wealth on the globe. So we live in a world of abundance, not scarcity. To insist on triage approaches is a political choice. To not use a system that secures everyone's basic human rights to things like shelter, food, education, healthcare. I'm going to stop there. I'm sure we'll have lots of time to continue to talk. Thanks for your attention.
Hello, everybody. These are hard acts to follow. I got really nervous about this talk because it's such an all-star lineup, so I did the thing you should never do, and I prepared way too many slides, so I don't know how this is going to be under 15 minutes, but I'll do my best here. I'm going to try and do 3 things. These are the 3 things. I'm going to introduce the design justice framework, talk about resistance to AI that's actually in practice, and end with the design justice principles. So when I leave this talk, I'm going to be heading to the airport, and when I get to the airport, I'm going to go through the millimeter wave scanning machine, which is the one that spins around you, and you put your hands up, and it scans your body, and it compares your body, and this is kind of hard to see from the back there, but basically this is the view that the TSA agents are going to see of the screen after I pass through. And when you approach the millimeter wave scanning system, a lot of cisgender people don't necessarily know this, but all trans and gender nonconforming people do. The TSA agent looks at you and they decide whether they think you're a boy or a girl. And if they think that you're a boy, they press the blue boy button. And if they think you're a girl, they press the pink girl button. And then the millimeter resolution scan of your body is compared to a statistical model of an average male or female body, boy or girl body. And anything that's anomalous to that model is going to be flagged and highlighted in bright yellow with a little red outline like that. So for people like me, for gender nonconforming people, and for many trans people, you can't win. If I get selected female, I'm going to get part of my body highlighted. If I get selected male, I'm going to get another part of my body highlighted based on the deviance or the way that my body is anomalous to a binary model of what human bodies are supposed to look like. Now, this means that cisnormativity is the idea that everybody is born with a gender identity and presentation that conforms to the sex that you were assigned at birth. And that system is reproduced in this socio-technical system, which is the array of the security protocol, the model that the TSA officer is following, the machine itself, the statistical model, which is binary based of male or female bodies, and so on and so forth. Now, for me, my white skin and my educational privilege and my position at a powerful institution is probably going to protect me from the worst harms of being classified as an anomaly, because I probably am not going to be, pulled out of security and hooded and whisked off to Guantanamo Bay or another one of the secret prisons in the US's global so-called war on terror, because I have certain kinds of privileges. I probably won't even miss my flight. I probably won't be pulled out for extended questioning as many people who might be mistakenly placed on the terrorist watch list, or might have a Muslim last name, or might have brown skin, or might have any one of a number of possible positions. Unlike mine, will be subject to. So it's probably just a minor inconvenience. But I use this example to talk about design justice and what it is, because it's a great way to think about how AI, which is really, when we say AI, we're usually just talking about machine learning, which is a technique for taking existing data sets and models that we have of how the world works and using them to predict things about the future, how those systems can't just be fixed, as we heard from both Virginia and Alondra, through ideas about fairness, making the data sets better, more inclusive. As Os Keys calls them, these are misgendering machines, or as Anna Lauren Hoffman talks about in an article she just published today, the idea that we can somehow fix this by having more inclusive data sets is wrong, and it limits the length of our vision, or the possible worlds that we might want to build. And part of why it's wrong is because that way of thinking about the harms of these systems systems ignores history and ignores deep structures. So misgendering and cisnormativity aren't things that were just created through AI systems and are being reproduced now. These are things that were imposed over hundreds of years of settler colonialism. This is an image of a Portuguese conquistador, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who's having his dogs devour the bodies of what he saw as gender nonconforming, or what he saw as men in women's clothing, Native people. So cisnormativity was imposed in the Americas and in much of the world through hundreds of years of violence under settler colonialism. It's not going to be fixed by a more inclusive data set, right? So what can we do? Well, I don't really know what we can do, but I'm part of a community of people that's trying to think about how one piece of dismantling or transforming systems of oppression is the design of socio-technical systems, people who are designers and developers who think of ourselves as part of the design justice network. So design justice is a growing community of practice, and we focus on the equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens. That's sort of the fairness thing. But also meaningful participation in design decisions and recognition of community-based indigenous and diasporic design traditions, knowledges, and practices. This is what Arturo Escobar talks about in his new book, Designs for the Pluriverse, of thinking about how we might design in ways that respect many different ways of knowing, understanding, being in, and making the world. Design justice is also a framework for analysis, in addition to a community of practice, a framework for analysis of how the design of socio-technical systems influences the distribution of benefits and burdens between various groups of people. But specifically, design justice talks about how design reproduces or challenges what Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination, the intersection of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural and historical inequality. So this is beyond fairness. This is thinking about the matrix of domination intersecting systems of oppression and what it means to design socio-technical systems that can transform or overturn them rather than constantly, time and time again, reproduce them. Because if we try and imagine a world that we want to build, one where many worlds fit, where we're included, and which is ecologically sustainable, certainly design has to be part of that, right? Design is one key to our collective liberation, but design of all socio-technical systems and the built environment and so on and so forth, and AI or machine learning, is deeply inequitable. It's inequitable in terms of who gets to build it, who the paid AI workers are, who the imagined users are, the goals of the systems, the sites in which we're building these things, the power relations that they're re-instantiating, and even the pedagogy that we're using as people are learning how to build these systems in computer science departments around the country and around the world, right? So again, sort of once more with feeling, right? This is about how the benefits of design flow to the more powerful people within the matrix of domination, based on people's location within that matrix of intersecting lines of oppression, and how the harms are distributed to fall upon those who are less powerful within the system, as Virginia's so excellently documented in the book. Design justice, though, is also about the design process, so the actual building of these things. Because I'm not ready to give up. I am willing to say no. There's many times we want to just say no, we don't want to build these things, as Alondra has asked us to think about. But I'm not willing to say that we never want to build these systems for any reason. And you didn't say that either. So if we're going to be building an X-ray system that's powered by AI, how are we going to build it? Well, design justice says that the design process needs to be rethought. So if the pink dots are experts with technical knowledge of how to build a particular type of system, current design processes centers them, and then the blue dots around the edge are the people whose lives are going to be impacted by the system. And design justice says that the process should look more like this, where there's still experts with technical knowledge involved in the system production, right? But the process is centered on the people whose lives are going to be most impacted. And the experts with technical knowledge take part in supporting and amplifying and building upon what the most impacted communities need, who have other kinds of expertise, who have lived experience, like my lived experience of how these millimeter wave systems fail. So there's lots of people thinking about this. This isn't just my work. This is growing from a community of practice. Design Justice Network was born in 2015 at the Allied Media Conference in Detroit. I'm going to really go fast through these because I don't know. This is us thinking about what the principles would look like. These are some zines that we made about how you do design justice work. So designers, organizers, technologists, activists sharing knowledge about what their design practices look like. This is some of the outgrowths of what's people who are influenced by the design justice principles, like the Building Consentful Tech project that Una Lee and the And Also Too design shop are making to think about how do we apply ideas about consent from consent culture in sex to designing technologies. Right? It's freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, and most of our AI systems are none of those things. This is a project where we interviewed over 100 technology practitioners who were trying to do public interest technology or community technology work about how, what works well and what doesn't. And the top takeaway from that work, which you can find at morethancode.cc, was that nothing about us without us, which is, of course, the slogan from the disability justice movement, that those who are most affected need to be centered in the design process, and not just in a consultative way, but in a way where they have governing power or there's some accountability. We rethink design sites. So this is a discotheque. This is a model developed by the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, which is sort of like a hackathon, but much more inclusive, community friendly. There's food, there's childcare, creating open spaces for thinking about how we design the futures that we want to have. This is a breastfeeding, breast pump and breast feeding policy hackathon that was informed by the design justice principles. And I teach a class at MIT, which is called the Co-Design Studio, where I'm trying to figure out how do I teach and learn together with students to do this type of work, to do design justice in practice. So we co-designed graphics for the Electronic Frontiers Surveillance Self-Defense Toolkit with them. Another student project working with the Chinese Progressive Association to think about how to produce publicity materials that could be circulated inside WeChat groups about the importance of data disaggregation in the upcoming census, because there's a whole sort of right-wing anti-disaggregation thing that's happening that I don't have time to talk about right now. Okay, the second part. I only have 5 minutes left, so I'll go real fast. So resistance is fertile. So I'm hopeful. Even though I started with a pretty intense, story and talked about hundreds of years of oppression, I think that we need to give our communities more credit for understanding what's happening and for organizing and mobilizing against it. Because wherever there's oppression, there are communities in resistance and people coming up with strategies and ways to deal, to survive, and to change oppressive systems. So right now, many of you may have seen that in Atlantic Plaza Towers over in Brooklyn, there's over 180 residents who rose up to say that the building owners are not going to be able to install a face lock system, which would analyze, the idea is you can't get entry to your building without a face scan. And there have been a number of letters from AI Now. Today there was another one that came out from Joy Boulamwini and Timnit Gebru and a number of others, basically critiquing the technical accuracy of these systems, because we do have to do that. We have to show how these systems are unfair, but that's part of a larger strategy of saying, no, we don't want them at all. And this is one reason why we don't want them, because we don't even know how unfair this particular system is that they're trying to install. There are wonderful projects like the People's Guide to AI by Mimi Onuha and by Diana Nacera, the Digital Defense Playbook that's coming from the Our Data Bodies project that Virginia's been part of. there's a race right now to see which city is going to be the first to ban facial recognition technology as it's used by law enforcement. The city of Somerville just announced that they've introduced a resolution to try and ban law enforcement use of these technologies. San Francisco is considering banning them. I think Oakland is as well. And there's a number of others. So it's kind of like we should figure out a way to give a prize to the first city to do it right, and encourage more to do that. Because in the age of Trump, we have to look for municipal, actions. And there's an incredible moment that we're living in right now, which you can find out a lot more about under the hashtag #TechWon'tBuildIt. This is everything from Google workers organizing to say to force Google to not take the project's Haven contract, which was actually a test run for getting Project Jedi, which was the Department of Defense's cloud transition. So Google workers successfully blocked that project. We have the No Tech for ICE campaign. And this is a picture. This is from this morning here in Manhattan as well as in DC. This is Mi Gente, who have been organizing protests outside Palantir offices in protest of the ways that Palantir is working with ICE to round up, detain, and deport undocumented people. And this isn't just a marginal thing that's happening. This also came out today. There's a new study in the UK of more than 1,000 tech workers, and they found that about 60% of those who are working on AI systems say they've worked on products they felt might harm society, which is terrible news, but also that 27% of them had quit their jobs as a result. And that, to me, is encouraging. Now, that those numbers should be flipped, but that means that Tech Won't Build It is not just a flash in the pan, and it's not something that's just marginal. And there are other initiatives like platform cooperativism to try and build platforms whose business model isn't just worker exploitation and data exploitation and extraction. But here in New York, for example, you've got Up and Go, which is a platform co-op where you can hire someone to clean your home, and it's going to link you to someone from a worker-owned cleaning company. And they are making determinations about how the data flows are going to work that aren't going to be as oppressive and exploitative to them. So my time is almost up, but I just like to end with this. These are the Design Justice Network principles, and these are the principles that those who are working in the Design Justice Network are trying to activate. So if you feel inspired, you could read them with me. I'll read them out loud. Principle 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, and to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Principle 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. 3, we prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer, because we know where good intentions lead. Principle 4, we view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process, rather than a point at the end of the process. We see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. And just in case that didn't sink home, we believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to design processes. 7, we share design knowledge and tools with our communities. 8, we work towards sustainable community-led and controlled outcomes. 9, we work towards non-exploitative solutions that reconnect us to the earth and to each other. And 10, before seeking new design solutions, we look for what's already working at the community level. We honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. You can sign that at designjusticenetwork.org. Thank you.
Mine's on the desktop. Presenter view. So we're going to change pace a little bit. Thank you so much, Mona, for having me. And I can't believe that I got to follow these incredible speakers. I'm so excited to be here. And we're going to talk about copyright law, which I'm sure is why all of you came out on this dreary, rainy day, was to learn about copyright law. But I mean, what you're actually going to find out is that the copyright problem within artificial intelligence is actually deeply related to the ethical questions that relate to justice that we're asking, and that all of the speakers you've heard from have been interrogating today. Now, increasingly, AI is adopted by our banks and our bosses, as Mona described earlier. It's being used by our cars and our courts, as our other speakers outlined. And implicit bias is still a significant and complex problem, which is why I don't have to say very much about all three of these examples, which have become endemic examples of the ways that implicit bias can channel our AI in a fundamentally biased direction. Now, I love this example because you'll see that there's only one woman in this Google search results for CEO, and that woman is Barbie. And CEO Barbie is not even a real Mattel product. She was dreamed up by the folks at The Onion for an article that critiqued Mattel for promoting unrealistic career images for girls. Now, in Google's defense, which I'm a little bit loath to do, but in Google's defense, there aren't gender parity among CEOs, but there are real women who do run some companies that maybe you've heard of, like Lockheed Martin, Hershey, General Motors, PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, and IBM, just to name a few. So where are those women? Well, Alondra mentioned the White House, the Obama White House's report on AI, and as the Obama White House noted, AI needs good data. If the data is incomplete or biased, AI can exacerbate problems of bias. Computer scientists in the room, you probably put it more bluntly, you say garbage in, garbage out. But that brings me to the legal question. Because as most of you know, AI learns by reading, viewing, and listening to copies of human-generated works. And I am a copyright lawyer by training, so to me, of course, this felt like a copyright problem. And as I dug into this project, I actually realized that the rules of copyright law are playing an enormous hidden role in the development of AI, from limiting the companies that can afford to compete to build artificial intelligence systems, to the ways that the data that is used to train those systems is selected and deployed. And part of that is why AI systems are often trained using easily available, legally low-risk works, even when those works are demonstrably biased. But there's actually a different part of copyright law, the fair use doctrine, that mediates amongst the normative values of competition, innovation, access, and fairness in the context of other kinds of innovative computational technologies. So I wondered maybe whether fair use was the answer to this fairer AI question. Could it do the work in the context of this same new innovative computational technology? And I'll spoiler alert for you, the answer is both a little good and a little bad. Because when I dug into this project, there was one example that really struck me as endemic of this problem, about how copyright law channels AI in a biased direction. And that example is the Enron emails. Who in this room knows about the Enron emails? Okay, about half of you. Well, the Enron emails are maybe for the folks at home on the internet, I'll look directly at the camera for you, maybe you don't know. There are 1.6 million real emails that were sent between the Enron employees, and they were publicly uploaded to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission back in 2003. Now, the Enron emails remain one of the largest data sets of real emails in the world, and they're, for that reason, one of the most prolific sources of AI training data. And if you think about what I mentioned earlier about how we're choosing our training data for AI systems, we're looking for something that's easily accessible and, as a copyright matter, legally low risk. Well, the chances of you being sued by a CEO of Enron for copyright infringement are, in legal terms, exceedingly remote. Now, you might think that this is good for some stuff. You can imagine why these emails might be good for teaching an AI system about how people folder emails, right? That might make sense. But it's worth remembering why we have these emails in the first place. Because if you think there might be some significant biases embedded in the email sent among the executives of a Houston oil and gas company that collapsed under federal investigation for fraud stemming from its systemic bias or problematic cultures, you would be right. The Enron emails are not representative, not geographically, not socioeconomically, definitely not in terms of race and gender. Researchers have actually used the Enron emails specifically to analyze gender bias and power dynamics. So empirically, we actually have data showing that the Enron emails encode the implicit biases from the employees who sent them. But these remain a go-to training data set for training AI systems because they're easily accessible and legally low risk, even though we know that the AI systems that are learning from the Enron emails are picking up these same implicit biases. Now, the issue of implicit bias in AI is certainly not new. I'm in the company of amazing computer scientists, social scientists, and legal scholars, including Batya Friedman, Helen Nissenbaum, Kate Crawford, Sophia Noble, and Danielle Citrin, who've examined the many sources of computational bias, from unexamined assumptions of creators to technologically flawed algorithm. And my work builds on that scholarship to talk about the most powerful law that's contributing to this implicit bias problem, which is copyright law. So maybe you're wondering, as I did when I started this project, how does copyright law contribute to AI's implicit bias problem? And more importantly, can copyright play a role in fixing it? And there's one easy way to talk about the implicit bias problem that gives a quick example about the copyright issue, and that example is cats. Everyone's excited for the cats, which is great. So I'm going to breeze through this pretty fast because we've already talked about how implicit bias is only going to be the start of a conversation about justice. We can't get too hung up on this question of fairness or bias if we want to actually make moves and have a decision and discussion about what's ethical and what is just. But if you look at this training data set, this is what was easily accessible and legally low risk for me. These are images of cats. Now, depending on what features an AI system fixates on, you're going to get two very different and equally problematic results. In part one, it fixates on the color of these cats, which is this melange of orange, black, and white. And it learns that that is the mark of catness. Well, then you might get a brindle dog with the same coloring, but it's not going to be a cat. And if you're training an AI system to recognize a cat, it strikes out. The other possibility is that it learns that, pointy ears, fluffy fur, and long tails are marks of catness, which you're going to miss out on This Is My Cat Nerd and Me hanging out, Devon Rexes, Manx cats, and bobcats. And wild cats generally are completely outside of the equation. So now we have this system that maybe these type 1 and type 2 errors aren't a big deal for you if you're just looking for something to throw into your slide deck. But if you're building a system that is trying to find cats that when they enter Washington Square Park, now you have a problem. And if you're the Taiwanese engineering student who wasn't able to renew his visa because his passport was rejected because his eyes were closed according to the AI system, these are more than AI goofs. These can be dangerous. And this is a data problem. And this, as I'm sure you've been waiting for, is where the copyright law comes in. Because even though the internet is full of cats, that doesn't mean the images we looked at are free for anyone to use. Lurking behind the mechanics of training AI is the much hairier matter of copyright law. And because most of those photographs of cats that would be used to train an AI system like that one can be protected by copyright law, we have to think about the friction that comes with using those images as training data. And I'm going to do it with another cat. Maybe you're familiar with Getty Images. It's one of the largest repositories of copyrighted images in the world. And they make pricing out a license pretty easy. This stock image for a single image of a tortoiseshell cat runs $375. When AI requires hundreds of thousands of images, we're talking about investing millions and millions of dollars in training data alone. And that doesn't include the engineers to build the algorithm, the marketers to get it out into the field, or the managers to supervise their work. Now, in the paper, I talk about the build it and buy it models that you can use to lawfully acquire artificial intelligence training data sets. A build it model would be something like Facebook, where your status updates and selfies become training data for natural language processing and face recognition systems. Or you could do what IBM does, which is partner with organizations like Memorial Sloan Kettering to get access to the kinds of data that they use to train their Watson for oncology. Now, given the friction mentioned by copyright law, it's not surprising that many AI creators turn instead to other types of low friction data, because it's hard to be a Facebook and it's hard to be an IBM. But some kinds of biased low friction data sidestep copyright questions to stumble into complicated ethical ones. Hacked emails like those from John Podesta, and that this is also just super bad advice about how to make risotto. If you've ever made risotto, you know this is, I don't know John personally, but this is bad advice. But these have a lot in common with the Enron emails. They're easily available in machine-readable formats. They're just as legally low risk. And that's why these emails are being used to train AI systems. But using these emails to train AI highlights how the rules of copyright law that privilege biased low-friction data as AI training data has implications for both ethics and privacy. Now, in the law, tort law, another area of law, has long grappled with how to deal with private information that is made public without consent. And my previous research examined how copyright law struggles with distinguishing the public from private in the context of non-consensual intimate image sharing. Perhaps you know better as revenge porn. But popular sources of biased low-friction data, from hacked emails to semi-public dating websites, which I discuss in the paper, are only further complicating this discussion. So what's the alternative? Well, you could invoke fair use to create fairer AI. Now, when it comes to asking whether using copyrighted works to train AI systems is part of this doctrine that's fair use, we're at something of a legal disadvantage. No court has yet weighed in on the issue, and the last time the Supreme Court took up the question of fair use was in 1994 when Two Live Crew was a thing. In Campbell versus Acuff Rose, a legal case from that year, the court acknowledged that Two Live Crew's parody of a Roy Orbison classic hit, Pretty Woman, could provide, quote, a social benefit by shedding light on an earlier work and in the process, creating a new one. Sounds a little bit like artificial intelligence. Fair use can feel complicated and fact-dependent, and that's because it is, but it's not random. And fair use has long done the work of considering and promoting the public benefit of innovative computational technologies. To put it more bluntly, fair use has given us digital plagiarism detectors, reverse engineered video games, and Google Books, which some of us use every day in our research and scholarship. And taken together, the legal analysis that underlies these and other cases suggests that using copyrighted images to train AI systems is a fair use under copyright law. But as Kate Crawford has observed, data will always bear the mark of its history. AI is biased because humans are biased. And AI systems learn to be all too human from reading, viewing, and listening to our human-created works. Now, we've talked about how copyright law has the power to channel AI in a fundamentally biased direction by looking at how copyright law can create biases in the training data sets. But it also has the profound power to, in some circumstances for limited uses, unbias AI. And the values embedded in the tradition of fair use, innovation, competition, and accessibility ultimately align with that equally important value of fairness. Fair use can quite literally promote the creation of fair AI in some circumstances. But the conversation can't really end there. This is the downside. Just because a use is legally permissible doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethically acceptable or even just. Take IBM's recent use of Creative Commons licensed images, which caused an outpouring of outrage among some of those whose pictures became part of IBM's data set. As Ryan Merkley, the CEO of Creative Commons, noted in the aftermath, copyright law is a poor tool for protection of individual privacy, to address research ethics in AI development, or to regulate the use of surveillance tools employed online. And distinguishing between what is legally permissible and what is ethically accessible remains an urgent question that demands the rigorous engagement and thoughtful reflection by courts, companies, and hopefully people like you.